Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. This episode describes an effective approach to make the transition to modern work at your company, affecting change with strategic, tactical steps. The key is to empathize with different constituents' perspectives and reactions, to understand how employees experience their work, and how executives experience change. For employees, reducing workplace friction means getting granular. If you implement and facilitate incremental, effective new working practices and monitor measurable improvements, you can demonstrate how new fundamentals affect positive change in employees' performance and happiness. Similarly, executives' daily experiences are often unlike frontline employees. Senior leaders can interpret data differently or miss information pivotal for making policy decisions that support the evolving needs of the workforce and the business. Is the information leaders typically rely on available? What other data or proxies can be persuasive? If trust is lacking, where can confidence best develop? You can build momentum from the ground up to adapt behaviors, influence culture, and shift mindsets. I'm delighted to be talking with Corinne Murray, Chief Strategist and founder at Agate, an organizational transformation and workplace strategy consultancy. Corinne's years of experience in organizational transformation and workplace innovation enable her to measurably enhance operational effectiveness and employee experience. Corinne's expertise enables her to drive impactful change and sustain competitive advantages. Hi, Corinne. How are you?
I'm good. Good to see you, Sophie.
Very good to see you. At the beginning, you studied religious studies and philosophy. Now, that's an interesting one.
It sure was. It was very instinctual. I was very drawn to it. And also, as a freshman at Gettysburg College, where I went for my undergrad, every freshman is required to take a seminar class. That was their way of anchoring. That's who you lived with. It was ingrown community immediately. And mine, partly by some recommendation and also just what was interesting, was called Death and the Meaning of Life. And it was taught by it was taught by the head of the religion department, who then became my advisor. So we dug into existentialism and what death represents in different cultures. Again, we were at Gettysburg, and so we learned about the battlefield. We were close to Washington, D.C., so we went down to the Holocaust Museum.
Fascinating.
We tried to go all around different religious and different cultural approaches to death and existence and what that means. And so that was really my gateway into religion at Gettysburg, which very much was taught through an interdisciplinary lens, which means I just got to learn about cultures.
Theology as religious history is the history of our culture, so that must have been fascinating.
Yeah.
Then you go into real estate. What?
Very, very logical transition.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I did graduate at the bottom of the 2008 crash. I graduated college in 2010, so maybe not on the downward turn.
Not a great time.
At the bottom of the barrel. So I had interned at CBRE through relationships the summer prior. And so in some ways it was what was available to me. And also it was a compelling, there was an itch I wanted to scratch. I was curious about what was there. Also knowing that while I loved my education, I had no idea how I was going to apply it in the real world. And so, that was where I went. And so I did market research and was really starting to just understand the commercial real estate landscape and also just the culture within commercial real estate, which is, I think, a very defined culture in New York City, around like the broker and landlord developer kind of cohort of folks. So it was a very interesting kind of anthropological experience for me as a 22, 23-year-old.
Right.
Yeah. And then, so I did some market research. Then I tried my hat at brokerage and learned a bit about repositioning buildings. So really the older buildings that are the pre-war buildings that were now starting to compete with these, brand new high-class glass towers. How do we not convert, but how do we reimagine what that kind of a building can be, get the tenants in, update all the basics, the corridors and things like that, just bring it up into the modern era.
So this is déjà vu right now.
Actually, I would say in 4 or so years, it'll be actual déjà vu. I think this is what's going to be needed.
Then you moved to Amex. That had been a client of yours. So how did that transition happen?
Yeah, so brokerage was not going to be for me long term, but I loved the experience. One, just really getting to be in New York City. And I could look at a building and based on that facade, it's probably built in the 1950s because it's slightly Art Deco, but it's, I had it all. The stuff that was stored in my brain at that moment was really interesting. Building nerd. Has atrophied since, but I still appreciate it. So building nerd that then started to be more interested in what happens inside the buildings. And so I was a leasing agent. And I was helping these tenants figure out, is this the right space for my company? That whole process of being a broker, actually, that was the first time that I even heard the words workplace strategy. And I'm like, ooh, what's that? I want to know more. And so that was really where that light bulb went off. I need to get further into the building and into the space.
When you're at Amex, it's change management, culture change, organization culture. You get deep pretty quickly.
Yes, I do. So the transition from brokerage to American Express, I worked on the account through CBRE for a couple of years. That was during the time where they were splitting global business travel away from the main business. So that was, as like a 25-year-old, I was, it's like a corporate divorce. Older people are like, sure, yeah. But no, it makes sense. That's how it makes sense in my brain. And so that was where I really got into, I popped the hood on how companies operate. And that was the thing that really felt more compelling to me in terms of there's just so many layers and so many levels of interdisciplinary reliance that needs to be sorted out. And then thinking about how space and just, a general workplace can support that. So that was where that all started to come together for me at Amex. And then my last role at Amex was around managing the workplace program there. So they had started something called Blue Work around 2010.
Then there are remote work programs, which I do remember from 2013, 2014, that Amex put in place. They wanted people work remotely, customer call center people. Yet some people said, can't do that because I don't have any space at home. And then they were deliberately recruiting people who wanted to work remotely fully.
Yes.
So please go into more on that. And then this Blue program was another level on that.
Yeah. So from my level exposure, I actually was part of the PMO team that was helping with that transition of just basically shutting down the phone centers and helping people set up their work from home setups. So I was part of the implementation phase of that.
And this is 2014, right?
This is like 2013. Yeah.
Yep.
So they were moving these folks remotely.
Yep.
If I remember correctly, there was it will help move you, or if you're in a position of not having a suitable arrangement to do this, some sort of severance situation. So I was part of the decommissioning all of these phone centers.
There were many people already then who were working fully remotely, but a number of people who weren't prepared, understanding what was necessary, didn't have good internet setup or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So I was working with local teams to partner with, local service providers. So, telecom, Wi-Fi, to make sure that, you are pumping additional bandwidth into these particular homes. At that role, I wasn't interfacing with the employees, but I was sort of like one layer behind the curtain, getting all of these resources in the right place.
Kind of the integration of HR, IT, and FM.
A little bit, wouldn't you say?
We've been talking about that offline, just to say.
So HR really was that front face of explaining and articulating and doing the more hands-on change management piece. I was in a role of resourcing them. So I had all the information with the telecom folks and making sure that, yes, we have everyone's home address to send their work from home kit. So all of that outfitting stuff is what I was responsible for.
So then why was Blue developed and what were the characteristics of it, that the opportunity and the challenge for you?
Yeah. So Blue Work predated my work with it. That it started around 2010 and I came in as came in with like Blue Work 2.0, my boss and I. And Blue Work 1.0 was about designing the spaces. And that was, at the time, 2010, a lot of open floor plan, a lot of bench seating, all the things that we know and either love or hate. But that was all across the Amex major hubs. So around the world, we were trying to create some sort of design baseline. Obviously, there were always going to be local twists, but there was an intent of just saying we want everyone to at least recognize when you walk into an American Express office.
Oh, okay.
Have some sort of brand recognition of like, yes, I'm visiting from Gurgaon, but I recognize this in the Salt Lake City office, or I recognize this in the Phoenix office. So all of that was coming from a built environment perspective.
What elements of work design came with that brand design?
Yes. So that brand design was paired with the work design it was hybrid as we currently understand it.
What caused Amex to want to do that? Because they already had this remote working group?
I think those were mutually exclusive, at least from they tended to be held separately. This was more about a real estate strategy and densification. And again, post 2008, just getting more efficient with what they had. And also like by the time it was 2015, when I was working on this project, the market was already on an upswing. And so it was valuable to have space to give back.
Okay.
So they were playing that game and also looking at the data to say, even when we expect people to be in the office 5 days a week, the average occupancy rate is roughly around 60%. And then, for the workplace nerds in the crowd, we all know that 60% is really 60% of the 80% capacity that every workplace is designed for.
Right.
So, which I remember learning those numbers. I was like, this is so dumb. I'm obviously like safety, I understand it, but that's not 100%.
Right.
Anyway, so that was really their lesson of, there are ways that we can be more efficient. And so that was really the cost-saving exercise that kicked all of this off. We had borrowed from, again, all of these like design and like physical workplace strategies were learned from the management consulting model of roughly for every 5 employees, there are 3 desks. So there was this sharing ratio distributed across the buildings with variances based on team dynamics. So treasury, for example, they tended to have closer to a 1-to-1 seating ratio because of proprietary data and just security and like visual reasons.
So there was adaptability for the individual teams. Interesting.
Amex, for better or for worse, was ahead of its time in terms of people's comfort and understanding of what all of this meant. And so the inherent response to a sharing ratio was like, well, just fight for as many more desks as possible.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't a comp. There wasn't something that that just the average person could say, oh, I understand this. And as long as my butt has a seat to sit in, it'll be fine.
So it sounds kind of messy.
It was very messy, but it had to be done. And so that the first 5 years were about designing the spaces, moving people in there, and setting up like the desk booking system. Again, this is the déjà vu of today, I believe.
Right.
And so like anytime I hear about it, I'm like, oh gosh, I've done this already. Like, can't we just like sort of, unplug it and plug it in again and maybe it'll work better this time?
But you were then having to design or develop that software in-house, whereas now obviously there are so many companies who are providing all kinds of great and very adaptable solutions.
Absolutely. And working for a financial services company, and this is where I really started to get curious about user experience and user interface problems, is because to book a desk, you needed to take like more than 10 clicks to get to a booked desk.
Oh, yeah.
So I was like, oh, no one's ever going to do this. And that's exactly what happened. So by the time I came in with my boss, who her background is more HR and IT, and I came with the real estate and workplace experience, we were positioned with the, not repositioning, but kind of the reinstitution of Blue Work in a way that is more user-friendly. So wave 1 was really about build the box, and wave 2, which I was a part of, was really about focusing on how do we help people use the box to the best of their ability. And a lot of it was change management driven. So we did a lot of like brand storytelling and, hey, this is why this exists, and this is how you use it, and this is why this is why it's so valuable to you. And it was also just a lot of listening. And it was both the active, let's have focus groups and meetings, and the others were just, paying attention to what was happening in the buildings. And one of the things that was so fascinating about just listening around the building is listening and just watching around the buildings is my hypothesis of the 10 plus clicks to go book a desk really, really got in the way of how Blue Work was being used. Because even me, and I was in charge of the program, I was like, well, I'm not going to, that's a waste, because with your eyes, you see open desks. And if someone and if someone walked up to you and said, I actually booked this desk for the day, you say, oh, okay, I thought it was open. You go somewhere else and you carry on. Not everyone apparently was as flexible as that. And so there were like contentious moments of like, well, I'm sitting here, can't you go somewhere else? And so it just, it tapped into a little bit of like lizard brain reaction in a lot of people because there was perceived scarcity. Interesting. It clocked into something that made people insecure and become more like hoarders because they felt they didn't have enough of what they needed. And so this is where we shifted from, my boss and I took the desk booking system away because we're like, it's an interference.
Because it actually created that conflict rather than solving it. Okay.
Totally. And so then the fear was, well, then it's just sort of anarchy. No, it didn't create anarchy because every team was anchored by where their SVP and their VPs were. And those people were in fixed locations.
So the kind of neighborhooding idea.
Exactly. So the neighborhoods already were like naturally formed, and then we just formalized them. Okay. And, then it became more about, okay, well, maybe the real estate team has an on-site for all of their global partners, and there's, 25 more people. But the HR team or whoever was our neighbor, they're pretty flexible, and they know that this is temporary. So like, it's fine if they see a stranger sitting in a couple of these desks over the course of the week, rather than it being, one independent person trying to hold their own. It was, we use the analogy of like, it was like borrowing sugar from your neighbor rather than like being in a sea of strangers and then trying to like find someone that looks familiar. So it was a really different shift.
When I interviewed Ryan Anderson, he was talking about neighborhooding, which I loved as a concept, and finding that as the solution that worked without any booking system. With you and your boss, effectively you were facilities management, even though that wasn't your role, but that was the HR, IT, and FM right there. The two of you had it together. So that's fascinating that you had everything that was necessary and became a change strategist at Gensler.
Yeah, my intention of going to Gensler was I was seeing all of these frictions in-house. And again, I'd mentioned I started to really tap into the concept of UX and UI and, learning about it from a digital perspective, but also seeing the easy application into my scope of work and what I was focusing on.
Right.
As a plucky mid-20s lady, I wanted to, like, I was just like, these things are broken. Why aren't we doing anything to improve them? And my naivete of working, not really recognizing where I was, and this is no shade to American Express, this is just big companies. And I was like, why can't we just do 1, 2, and 3? And it's because big companies just don't move with that kind of pacing. So it was mixed with that. And also, I am nothing if not wanting to be a well-rounded person. And I had never been on the consulting side. So I wanted to sit on the other side of the fence and see what sort of progress or what kind of influence the external advising position would offer me in pursuing this type of work. Like, I think in this period of time is where I really locked in on caring about the future of work and being really flexible about what position I was in order to make it happen. I love workplace, but my definition of workplace is quite expansive.
Which includes culture change. What you were dealing at American Express, as well as then at Gensler, was to do with culture change, which is so interesting to me because early on when I was looking at how space manifests culture, and that when you then do a whole huge office redesign, you're going from one cultural expression to another. And that is a very interesting transition. So just a little bit more about this expansion of how you're looking at workplace / culture / the future of work, and then the transition to WeWork, where you become the head of future of work practice.
Yeah, so the time at Gensler was really short just because WeWork kind of picked me up on the rocket ship and I had to hold on. But it really was a very similar trajectory. At Gensler, it was really focused on that change and the people the behavioral dynamics of the culture change that does get manifested in the built environment, which it often is the thing that tends to go underserved. And a lot of it is because of just how physical workplace transformations get priced out. And a lot of that money, anyone who knows actual workplace, real estate and workplace design knows that those resources get spent on the physical materials. But anyone like us is always going to be banging on about there needs to be protected budget for how do we help people get from this one cultural manifestation all the way into another. And that doesn't happen easily. Right.
And that's actually why a foosball table is a cheap version. I don't need that much space. Deeply cheap. It's a small space. I can fit it in, and a foosball table doesn't cost much. So there we go. Done. Interesting. Yeah.
This all really, really crystallized for me at WeWork. And again, WeWork had that reputation of having all the sparkly, cultural confetti of like, we had video games on our lounge floors and we had the kombucha and the beers and the this and the that. And all of that obviously has its place and was really nice to have at certain moments. I also think that it did a slight disservice to the true impact that a lot of the folks were trying to have in terms of it, because it's the loud, shiny stuff. It's the stuff that we can see, touch, all the very, tactile and tangible stuff. But WeWork, while I was there and, building out this future of work and workplace practice, was, again, trying to do that expansion of it's not just about the place. It's about the tools and the resources that we have. It's about the norms and behaviors we have around how we work together and how all of those things equal an employee experience and how that employee experience then informs a culture. Because that was something that I really started to get really crisp about is culture is really, really difficult. And this is where my religious studies work really started to tie back in of saying we can't decide what a culture is. We can decide what an experience is. And what that collective experience amasses to is the culture. So it's hard to measure, just as we always know. It's hard to define. But the bite-sized experiences are what, one, we can play around with and manipulate and measure and, start to extrapolate what kind of culture does this type of experience lend to.
And align with and resonate with. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So I was able to really start to figure out what is that formula. Healthy, awesome culture is obviously what we're all looking for. It's going to manifest in a whole host of different ways. But here's the ways that we can start to build a foundation of reliably good
foundation,
unsexy experience that just doesn't get in the way of that.
You started WeWork in 2018, having very similar views, I believe, of the future of work. We were imagining it was right there. It was coming. It was almost upon us. What were you trying to implement and communicate and prepare for at WeWork for the future of work whenever it was arriving?
Oh, that's such a great way of putting it. At that moment, I think what I was preparing myself for, our teams for, our clients for, was that good experience mattered. Good employee experience was just as important as good customer or client experience.
Right.
And so, again, kind of that high tides raise all ships mentality was really, I was able to start actualizing that into my work because, I mean... if I want to be really silly about it, I kind of, it will also just show how much of a millennial I am. The court scene of Legally Blonde, when Elle Woods is, arguing, how could someone who was just at a spinning class shoot their husband? She's like, endorphins make people happy, and happy people just don't shoot people. Like, that's like, if I want to like be really ditzy and silly.
Totally know the scene. In the show notes, I will link to that scene.
For anyone who's not a millennial woman or someone who's seen that movie. But anyway, seminal movie. But basically the logic was when we know things are getting in the way of our people doing work, and let's assume that people enjoy being productive. Let's just have that as our baseline.
Yep.
Why are we okay with things being challenging for them? And that was a completely different framing than... well, what makes people happy?
Yep.
Putting Elle Woods to the side, articulating, defining, and really understanding what makes people happy is very fleeting. And also most people aren't that great at identifying it. So it's a mixed bag.
And it isn't necessarily, as you say, fleeting versus sustainable. So what experience is that higher baseline that you can create and maintain?
That's right. So it was around the time that I had first read Thinking Fast and Slow and understanding the difference between like the experiencing brain and the remembering brain. And so the experiencing brain, like it's already gone. It is fleeting. Yeah. The remembering brain is very powerful, but it also has a very skewed perspective, and it tends to skew to the negative. And so that was really where I was starting to build this logic around.
Right.
Let's build this universal, ubiquitous foundation of solid delivery of, we're going to make sure that the Wi-Fi is good. We're going to make sure that everyone is like no more than 50 or 100 paces to a bathroom, or like all of these really just fundamental, unsexy things that put mental load on us.
Don't generate the negatives that you don't necessarily identify, but you feel that.
Exactly. I even had stories of this from Amex of like on engineering floors, there would be a line for the men's room because engineering and product teams disproportionately can be men. Little quirky things like that, that a traditional real estate and workplace strategy aren't going to pick up on.
Yeah.
That was how all of this stuff was really starting to shape for me. And it was all through this thesis of, if we just assume that everyone wants to be productive, even if everyone's definition of it is different, if everyone's intention is that, how do we get stuff out of the way so people can do more of it?
You end with WeWork in February 2020. Was that WeWork shutting down? Or it was, I don't even remember. Was it Adam?
Yeah. The WeWork crash spiral was most of the year of 2019. So my official exit from WeWork was in November with the big wave of layoffs.
Okay.
And so February was the completion of my garden leave.
The pandemic strikes. It's February 2020, and you start working for RXR Realty. What are they looking for from you at this extraordinary time? How does your mindset shift? You know about remote working. You know how that works, what it takes, what the challenges are, what some of the stresses and strains are from all that time at Amex. So what was your perspective then? As far as I'm concerned, the future of work happened.
Yeah.
During March and April, what was going on?
Yeah. So I started with RXR the week that the city basically shut down.
Wow.
But to preface that, what I got hired for was to kind of have like a split role. First would be helping their digital product team. They were building a custom, custom tenant experience app for their portfolio. And so I was going to be doing a lot of the subject matter expertise, like persona development and use case development and all of those things, working with a teammate of mine from WeWork. And then also informing how do they start to reposition, not necessarily the design of their buildings, but the offerings of their buildings. Like, what are people coming into the office for? And so, prior to the pandemic, the way that they were talking was, they weren't necessarily saying we want to WeWorkify our portfolio, but they were at a point where they were recognizing that, the open plan, like isolated corporate stack was not necessarily going to be the way of the future. They wanted to use me and my expertise of activity-based working to extrapolate ABW into a building stack rather than just a corporate workplace stack. So figuring out what are these different types of environments and services that we can provide to our entire portfolio and our entire tenant list as additional flex offerings or, rededicated flex offerings and things like that. So really just, they were thinking about the recomposition of a commercial building.
I have talked about activity-based working with Ryan and with Tim Olben from the Easement Index. Please just define activity-based working just for the listeners.
Yeah. So my definition of activity-based working is having environments and having systems that support different types of activities. So for most workers, work can be split into one of four quadrants: synchronous collaboration, asynchronous collaboration, individual focus, and socializing. All of those all of those behaviors are components of how we work. And activity-based working is really about creating distinct environments and systems that support those different behaviors. Obviously, it's a little more loosey-goosey in practice in terms of, some people who like to do individual focus work in a busy cafe. They're, outliers in a way.
Right.
But creating spaces that encourage focus on the visual level, so like reducing visual distractions, on the auditory level, so making sure that it's quiet, all those different tiny facets.
And this activity-based working was developed almost 40 years ago, I would say, probably now.
First designed in the 80s. Yes. And then the concept formalized in the late 90s, I think.
And then what happened now? Everybody's suddenly not in those offices.
I took on the role of really kind of being the insight creator. I was already reading the news and had my hypotheses, and I was really introducing the future of work to this particular landlord and developer. And it was one that was very starkly different than their own estimations. There was an interesting sort of impasse of the expectations of commercial real estate with the natural patterns and just trends of how people were behaving, and they weren't compatible. There was a lot of trying to negotiate and square that circle of, okay, in the remote world, in the great work from home experiment stretch, the goal of most landlords was to ensure that their buildings and their environments were safe to be in. And a lot of that was around, this is where the whole conversation about hygiene theater was really loud, was because landlords needed to prove that their spaces were safe for people to occupy, because otherwise tenants were going to argue force majeure. And force majeure is always baked into leases that say, force majeure is basically like force of God
So that's why the safety. Oh.
Yeah. Maybe not the whole thing, but yes.
Yep.
A lot of what drove the hygiene theater aspect was being really abundantly clear. You can't argue that this isn't a safe space. Like, you can choose to keep your people at home for your own corporate policy purposes, but it's not because of us.
But you can't breach your contract. Okay.
Exactly. So that was a really interesting relation dynamic to see play out. And again, having spent years in commercial real estate, it was a really interesting moment to be recontextualized in the commercial real estate industry and just understand, one, what different wavelengths they operate on versus just how companies and how employees do. And just this was the first time that it was really going to be contentious. Most of the time they've been symbiotic enough of you do your thing and we'll do ours. But the future happened, as you've said, in 2020 of there were, I joke around and I say those were the before times. In the now times, things are fundamentally different and they are more at odds. And a lot of it had to do with how it changed downtowns. So what was really fun about RXR, my time at RXR for me, was I had spent all this time going really, really deep in how companies operate and employee behavior and the really tiny atomic dynamics of work. And then I was letting myself willingly get thrown into the dynamics of a city. And the role that buildings and spaces play in the health of a city.
What were a couple of key epiphanies for you about city dynamics and how offices or workplaces impact that flow?
Yeah, my biggest takeaway from my time at RXR was that I don't think that central business districts, as they're structured today, are sustainable with the future of work. Mm-hmm. Right. And because New York City had some really, really tough months. San Francisco has had the same, and other major cities have had their challenges, but only in those commercial areas. In the more residential areas of New York, I live in Park Slope, and so. I live I have a main street and things like that. These areas have been thriving. Right. And if anything, they are missing those third places of, where people can actually do work outside of the cafes and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think that central business districts are sustainable. That was my big lesson. And unfortunately, where a lot of commercial landlords and developers are stuck right now is their assets are in these commercial districts. Right. And the success of their buildings is based on the value of their retail space. Right. So, and the value of their retail space is based on foot traffic. And when there's less foot traffic, it is a house of cards. And so when that population dissipates. Yeah.
And it had been a strategy that was energized by real estate to create this concentration. So it's just observing that as we evolve, and it just happened to evolve very fast. Yes. From the beginning of 2020 through to, let's say, the end of 2022, I was observing, really listening, learning, and recognizing the changing sentiments, the changing awareness of many, many employees about their working lives, which was manifested in the Great Resignation, particularly in the US, where there has been a very focused work culture, and work is the priority.
That's a very generous way of saying it. We are workaholics.
It is not the most positive work culture, I will say, in terms of enabling workers to create a healthy balance in their lives. This epiphany that particularly this country was going through, which other countries previously had and continue to have more flexible work cultures and arrangements. What were you seeing and experiencing in the real estate space with some people who had very traditional ways of thinking about offices, but also, I'm sure, talking to WeWork's former colleagues there and also employees? What did you hear and how are you feeling about it?
Yeah, I think that best example, honestly, would be my dad. So my dad came and visited my office at Amex. So this was in 2015 or so. We were going to dinner. I grew up on Long Island, so easy train ride. And so I'm showing him around. I'm explaining everything, and he works in building appraisals. He is the subject matter expert for banks who are receiving loan requests. And so he and his partner are the ones who are validating these loan applications and these building valuations that are being put forth.
So in recent years, wow.
Yeah, it's also fascinating. So he comes to visit, and I'm showing him, what was Blue Work, which was flexible and, open seating and all this kind of stuff. And he's like, I could never do this. I need an office. And to his credit, he's not wrong, because his entire job is reading proposals and reading, evaluating reports. So he needs quiet. And in an open environment like that, he would never have gotten it. And so his productivity, his effectiveness as an individual contributor would have completely dropped in a setting like that. And so for most of his time, he sat in a tiny office on Long Island, had his office, his partner was in the next room. And then through the pandemic, the company that he works for was saying, oh no, you're actually going to go to the hub office, which was open seating and desk sharing and all this kind of stuff.
Okay.
And he's in his 60s, and he's like, the pandemic was a really interesting unlock for him, because he was sort of like, yeah, Corinne does this stuff, but it doesn't make sense for me. But I get, he, conceptually understood it. And then the pandemic hit, and he's working, 10, 15 feet away from me. And he's like, why would I work anywhere else? I'm like, I've been telling you this for years. But yeah, because for his use case, it doesn't make sense. He doesn't need, he is a perfect example of someone who, unless he is having a meeting with a client, which is very, very rare, he is sitting at a desk reading reports and reviewing and updating things.
And as long as he has peace and quiet, it could be anywhere.
That is exactly right. So he is a perfect use case of someone who, in 2015, if he were part of one of those big workplace transformations, he would have been an enormous thorn in the side, because that new way of working was not conducive to to what his needs actually were. But there wouldn't have been room to accommodate for him. And now he had the agency of being like, and everyone was going through it. And so I think it was the sort of the group experience for him was like, oh, now I see. I actually didn't need all of those things, to your point. So long as there's peace and quiet and I have it in my home office, great.
For fellow millennials, what were you seeing? Because for millennials, they're at a particular time of their career where it's prime growth, prime earning, pushing forward, attaining greater levels of leadership, starting families and stuff like that. What were you seeing in terms of their realizations and revelations?
Particularly in my group of friends, I was the only one who had any experience with flexible working or remote work. And so it was really interesting seeing that evolution of, oh, I'm never going back to the office for more than 3 days a week unless I absolutely have to. It was this release valve experience for them, whether kids were in the picture or not. If you ask anyone who's been doing workplace strategy, prior to 2020, people will tell you that the open plan workplaces burnt people out because it was so much extra sensory exposure to visual distractions and auditory distractions and all the things. So everyone's tired. And then a pandemic happens and we're more tired. And so there's, whether we realize it or not, there is this demasking and just a sort of resting state experience that you are able to have when you're afforded flexibility. And maybe working from home on certain days of the week isn't what's the long-term fix, but I do think that it is part of a recalibration experience that's needed for a lot of us. That is letting us sort of gather our rosebuds and get ready for what's next. And then we get to start to figure out maybe, that's where the urban design piece comes back in of the 10-minute, 15, 20-minute city concepts become more real when we're more ready for it. So we're still in the behavior learning place, and eventually we'll get to the redistribution or recalibration of the resources needed and where they're needed. But yeah, the millennials, I think, because of where we are in life, are the ones that have needed this the most.
And therefore, I see them driving for that change or being more determinative about the change. Also because for Gen Zs, they actually don't know anything different. They can't contrast and compare and say, I do actually know what it was like before. I have tried that. That didn't work, and here's why. So now looking at the big picture, you've talked about when we get there. You and I have talked about the future of work is here, but most people are not. And even I don't know the best cadence for my life. And of course, that does change over different times, different places, different seasons. And really trying always to be leaning into how do I work best doing this type of work? And I am leaning into it. So for people who are not used to it, who work for big organizations, I know how hard that journey is. It's so unevenly distributed now. How would you describe the full picture? And how do you see that changing? What can be done to help reduce that strain and move people faster to be understanding and committing to not the future, but where we are?
Yeah.
Small question.
Easy peasy. As you reiterated, the future is here. I think the future is here. As we've said, the now times started in 2020. And there's always this component of we're never going to get to the future because the yardstick is always kicked out further and further, as it should be. To me, it really does still tie back to questions and back to things that I was trying to solve at Amex, which is how do we get stuff out of the way? That problem is still relevant, or like that approach to the problem is still relevant. The solutions and the ideas that come with it are what have modified and evolved and just, full stop changed. But I think we're getting stuck focusing on, we've talked about this, we're getting stuck focused on where things happen, not why they happen or how they can, how they can be done better. And that's the real friction is like, we're just focusing on the wrong set of inputs. Yeah. And it's not to say that those inputs are not important. It's just they come later. We're jumping in at chapter 17 rather than coming in at chapter 1.
And creating a new framework that then says, that's one piece and these are all the other pieces. And that's where I think the pandemic threw everything up in the air and was a great time to rearrange the pieces and think differently. However, they all did manage to drop down and this became the focus.
And we're picking up the pieces that we are familiar with. Yeah.
So how are you helping stimulate understanding and generate continued change and momentum forward?
Yeah. So I've been, with all this UX, UI knowledge that I've been talking about through the course of the past 10 years for me, I've been developing and continue to iterate this concept of how we measure effectiveness is that's the phrase that I use, which is a combined, balanced approach to measuring productivity and measuring experience in the UX, UI kind of way, not just, do people show up to the party or, what's their NPS, Net Promoter Score for the folks. Yes. Right. And so my definition of experience, or what fits into this definition of experience in this formula, is really based on access. Like, do people have access to the resources that they need? And that can, again, that's a really expansive question of, are the resources, do they have places to work? Yes or no? Are those places powered with the right type of infrastructure to help them be productive? Do people understand the norms and expectations of working on particular types of work? So all of these things that are really about creating the social codes and the infrastructure of how work happens. which is very different than how most people and most companies define employee experience. So there's this whole vast set of nascent data that does exist and probably in some ways is already being measured. It's just not being collected in one place.
And presented in an integrated picture as to why it matters for someone.
Exactly. And so I'm very sensitive to how productivity is measured, because productivity is, how much output you can create in a certain period of time. And that is that number doesn't actually live in reality. What measuring it in balance with this experience, and again, the inputs for that can vary company to company, but it contextualizes the productivity, because you can't expect, a high level of productivity from someone who isn't resourced in a way that guarantees at least a baseline level of success. So it's a way to get away from the very hand wavy way that we can measure productivity or measure happiness in the workplace or things like that, and really ground it into these can be driven into KPIs and OKRs and things that organizations within a business can actually deliver on and create this composite of this is our experience.
As we actually talked about before the interview, you're getting granular. As you were doing at Amex, it's that foundational level that raises up to help everybody make sure that they have the environment, they have the tools, that they have everything that they need to be able to step up to the new demands of work.
Yeah.
What about at the higher levels? There's the managers, obviously they need training, but the executives and the CEOs. What are the best ways to try and shift their mindsets to have that better awareness that they need to be committing to this, rather than saying, okay, fine, I'm not going to mandate people back to the office. We'll do this hybrid thing, but I'm not actually going to put money behind that. I don't want to do any more than that.
Yeah. This is where I am using this effectiveness stuff as a bit of a Trojan horse.
Okay.
Because a lot of what my experience with executives has been is there are two sides to why there's such an adamant preference for having employees back in the office. One is not, I don't say selfish in negative terms. I mean, selfish in terms of like centering the needs of that executive or that executive team.
Sure.
Their job is easier, or their job, maybe not easier. They are used to doing their job by kind of just sitting in one place and the flow of information coming to them. If they're in their office, they're not necessarily going to other rooms to have those meetings. People are coming to them. And so there's this constant flow.
The lived experience is very different. Yeah.
And it's very interesting when you take that step back and you're like, their lived experience is so radically different than literally everyone else in their organization. And yet they're the ones that are dictating how everyone else should be behaving. It's outside of like the seniority dynamics. It just doesn't match there. And they have that blind spot because they haven't been that knowledge worker or that person on the ground in so long. So their own inputs about what they think is right is outdated. But that's a little bit of a side conversation. But part of the other side of the preference is I don't think they feel like they have the data that's needed to feel comfortable with flexibility. They don't see another way to get the sense that people are being productive, that things are moving forward without having that energetic feeling in a workplace. I think that's their emotional pulse on things, and they don't have the right data to counterbalance it and have them be more open to there are other ways that this can be done.
Which fundamentally goes to trust, and trust has not been the foundation of their working experiences for decades.
Right. Yeah. So how it's teaching them a completely new set of exercises and waiting for proof of concept for them to be comfortable with it. Because it is a gamble from where they sit. I have compassion for where they're sitting because they are in these roles with the responsibility of being a good steward to the business that they are managing.
During very difficult times where the last thing that they need is to be learning a whole new way of working. Yep.
Right. Yeah. Let's just throw 7 wrenches in at the same time and see what happens. That is every executive's worst nightmare. So I fully understand why there is that resistance. And so, and not wanting to put money behind it, not just like there's the experimentation resistance, and then there's the cost resistance. So to me, this effectiveness path is a way to give them the data to say, hey, to create the story and business justification for, it's okay to let the reins loosen up on these couple of things, and we'll go slow and we'll change these micro things one at a time. That's the other thing too, is there's this perception.
And you can see the benefits of them. Yeah.
Yeah. There's this huge perception of change only happens when like there's a big bang and there is a before and an after. When we start to introduce gradual, like, sort of snowball change, I think there will be more willingness. It's just, it hasn't been done. Snowballing change. So like, starting with the things that create friction. One that I tend to focus on with clients right now, because it's pretty ubiquitous, is we all have too many meetings.
Just to end out, it's been a fantastic conversation. You say hybrid is broken. What do you mean by broken, and what's the way to fix it?
I do not mean hybrid is broken and let's go back to what was. I mean, hybrid is broken and it's time for us to repair what's been broken and make it even stronger than before. So the Japanese tradition of kintsugi, the taking of a broken piece of like a bowl or a mug and reinforcing it with gold paint. So it actually reinforces and makes something stronger than it was initially. So there's plenty of beautiful metaphor in that. Hybrid is not broken the concept is not broken. Our application of it is what's broken. And why it's broken is because we have been almost only exclusively focused on where hybrid happens, rather than what is like, what are the dynamics of hybrid work? What is it? Why is it? And then we can get into the where it happens. So again, it's all about our sequencing of what needs to be decided first. That's what's broken. So certainly not throwing baby out with the bathwater. It is, let's go back to the drawing board and reshuffle the puzzle pieces we've been playing with.
Corinne, I could do at least another hour, if not 2.
At least.
At least. So thank you very much for sharing a extraordinarily relevant and interesting journey, and the number of déjà vus you must have had over the last 5 years. It's really, really interesting to see how you're applying all these different aspects and bringing them together to help us move forward in the most productive ways.
Thank you so much. This was such a great conversation.
Thanks again so much to Corinne Murray, Chief Strategist and founder at Agate. You can follow Corinne on LinkedIn and visit Agate's website at agate.studio, agate.studio. You can also sign up for her newsletter at theworkplacestrategist.substack.com. Immediate action tip. Hybrid is broken. To repair what is broken and make it stronger, consider the dynamics of hybrid work. What and why, rather than just where it happens. It's about sequencing and shuffling the puzzle pieces to figure out what needs to be decided first. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. You can also write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated useful articles, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Thanks for listening. Until next time.